Okay, so I'm just going to kick off because we're already at 10 minutes past. So I hope that's fine for everybody. Just to introduce myself, my name is Vicky-Rae Reid. I'm actually a Ngāti Toa young woman from Aotearoa in New Zealand. So just so you know, I'm actually of Maori heritage, which is the flag behind me here. I'm actually very proud to be able to present this conversation today about Indigenous people and basically the call for a new social construct, especially within an Indigenous space, which generally doesn't happen. So I'll just start by, let me just get, so I'll just start with an acknowledgement of the country. So we acknowledge and respect the traditional owners of the lands, the Darug, the Gundungurra, Darawal, Wiradjuri and Bundjalung peoples of the Eora Nation upon which we live and work. We continue to value the generations of knowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people embedded within our community and acknowledge their sovereignty, which was never ceded. So, sorry, haven't done it this way before. So we'll just kick off with a little bit of housekeeping. That, as I previously stated, today's session will be recorded. So you do not need to have your camera on if you do not feel comfortable. And also please feel free to use the chat function if you do not wish to have your voice recorded. We are entering an Indigenous space, so we will not be navigating our feelings and experiences for the colonised audience. This is a very heavily and potentially triggering topic for many of the world's Indigenous people. So when it does come to the discussion, please give each other time to speak and articulate themselves properly before jumping in. And lastly, just remember to breathe, because breathing is a privilege that a lot of the world's Indigenous people do not have. They usually have to navigate those spaces, and if it's okay for them to even take a breath. I don't think I really need to go into the whole Black Lives Matter movement and the implications that have happened there. So why do we even observe the International Day for persons with, for the world's Indigenous peoples? So I'm going to play a short video and then we'll come back and have a bit of a conversation.
The International Day for the World's Indigenous Peoples. It's celebrated on 9th August every year. But why do we observe this day? Is Indigenous culture really that important that we have to celebrate it with a special day? Are they more important than mainstream ethnic groups? Well, let's put that into perspective. There are around 370 million Indigenous people worldwide, representing only around 5% of the global population. Yet they account for 5,000 distinct cultures and speak an overwhelming majority of the world's 7,000 known languages. This means that Indigenous peoples, they hold most of the world's cultural diversity, even though they constitute just a fraction of its population. And that diversity, it brings with it priceless knowledge. There's knowledge about our ancestry, about our environment and our place in it, even about our belief systems and our social structures. And this knowledge, it's often hyper-local. It's winnowed through generations and specific to a particular place and to a particular people.
Living on the piece of land that we have managed for thousands of years, we have developed and accumulated a vast range of body of knowledge. And this knowledge, we have applied it, whether it's in our traditional institutions, governance systems, in our ways of resource management, cultural expressions, science, etc., etc. I see today that we also can present a lot of solutions to the problems that the world is facing.
So preserving this kind of knowledge and drawing lessons from them, it could be invaluable to charting a better future for humankind as a species.
So we are knowledge holders and we want to also contribute, and we do not want to lose this.
But though invaluable, Indigenous people, they account for a third of the world's extremely poor rural population. And with far less political representation than mainstream ethnic groups, they are vulnerable to exploitation, especially when it comes to their land. Globalization also means that ideas and systems and languages of mainstream society, they're spreading faster and wider, diluting the culture of indigenous peoples who are very often under pressure to assimilate. That's a lot of diversity, a lot of knowledge, under serious threat. So why do we observe this day? For indigenous peoples, it's a chance to celebrate their own cultures and be proud of their place in modern society. For mainstream society, it's a chance to understand the challenges that these communities continue to face, especially when it comes to land rights and access to education. But more than that, it's a chance to appreciate just how much we can learn from them.
Okay, so that's why we observe the day and the reasons why we have it. As you can understand, that each Indigenous culture has a lot of their own little bits and pieces. There's a difference between laws, as in LAWS, as well as law, which is LORE. So when it comes into formulating social contracts, especially when we're looking at things such as the constitution of a nation, a lot of that law does not get taken into consideration. And that's primarily where this conversation and where this disconnect between Indigenous peoples and these social contracts, where that comes into place. So, like I said, what is a social contract? It's basically a perceived agreement amongst the people of a state about the rules that will define their government. One kind of social contract is a constitution. The constitution says how these decisions are made, sets limits of the power of the leaders and the people that have authority. So why do Australian Indigenous people need a new one? Firstly, as I said in the acknowledgement, their sovereignty was never ceded, which means that they did not hand over the rights to their lands and to their people to the Crown. They did not. And as such, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are not mentioned within the Constitution. Now, I don't know about the rest of you, but for me personally, that's a pressure point. Basically, when you have, well, they didn't even invite people into their lands. Their lands were more or less overtaken by the colonizers. So to basically ask, at that point of invasion, what conditions would you like to live by? That didn't happen. So the Constitution of Australia still allows for racial discrimination, not just against Aboriginal and Torres Strait peoples, but against anybody. Indigenous people are amongst the most socially excluded in Australia, with only 2.2% of the federal parliament comprised of Indigenous folks. I'm not sure about if any of you have actually entered a space where you are basically the token person in the room, but it happens a lot more for the BIPOC community than what it does anybody else. And it really shouldn't, especially if you're coming from an inclusion space. So this exclusion from Parliament is largely a result of cultural and ethnic default in leadership and exclusionary values held by the Australian Parliament. So I'm having a little bit of technical, deal with me. So I'm going to show you another short video. This one runs for about 11 minutes, but there's a very good reason why I'm showing you this one. The main reason, I don't know how many of you have already seen this Q&A or seen a highlight of it, but what we're dealing with here is an Indigenous woman that has been invited to a panel on national television to talk about Indigenous issues. Yet when she gets there, she's dealing with what we as Indigenous people deal with every day, where it's cisgendered white men talking either over her or on her behalf. So I'm just going to play this video now, and then we'll have a couple of conversations about it after.
Thank you, brother, for your question. The GAP report shows that Indigenous men will die 10.6 years less than their non-Indigenous counterparts. I, as an Indigenous woman, have the odds already stacked against me. I'm 9.5 years less life expectancy than my non-Indigenous counterparts. This Close the Gap initiative, which was meant to close the disparity in terms of Indigenous health, welfare and education, has only broadened. 6 out of the 7 targets have only been met. 6. That is not good enough. Malcolm Turnbull walked out of the Close the Gap report, walked out of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. When do Indigenous people get a social, cultural and economic empowerment and voice in Parliament? We're asking to deconstruct the systems that exist. We're asking to be invited to the table. The Indigenous Advisory Body wouldn't hold any political sway whatsoever. It's an advisory body for members of Parliament who are already in a position to influence the parliamentary decisions. Now, I am really tired of non-Indigenous members in Parliament, like the Nick Scullions, who actually didn't put it to vote, who didn't bother to poll it, because their instincts told them that it wouldn't work. So I don't know how you bridge the gap in child mortality. I don't know how you bridge the gap in terms of Aboriginal people are still struggling to have a voice. We are the sovereign owners of this country. I am a Wongatha Yamaji Noongar Gidja. We have never ceded sovereignty. I am tired of begging and asking for our humanity. When is it enough? My mother, at 31, went back to law school. I'll tell you about Closing the Gap because it's coming from Indigenous peoples, not from initiatives created in Parliament. As an Aboriginal woman, went back and became the first Indigenous female state prosecutor in Western Australia. I'm a daughter of 5 girls. Every single one of us is in university. My sister is in medicine at the moment. My 2 younger sisters are about to graduate. My twin sister is as a university graduate. I have qualified through university. I'm about to go into my honours at Curtin University. So in terms of closing this gap and this healing that they want to create, there is no healing going on. When you apologise, you do not do it again. The thing is with the stolen generations is that we are still having Aboriginal children forcibly removed from their homes without consultation from their parent or guardian and going straight into the system. Aboriginal people are still denied the basic human rights in accordance to the UN Declaration for Indigenous rights for Aboriginal people. The fact that the UN have absolutely slammed Australia in terms of its treatment of Aboriginal people is a disgrace.
Sharina, I'm going to...
So in terms of answering your...
I'll just put something to you as a question.
Yeah. So in terms
the question was talking about Malcolm Turnbull's engagement.
It's about parliamentary engagement.
Do you think it goes to leadership, though?
Absolutely. I want Aboriginal people. We've got the incredible Patrick Dodson, Senator Patrick Dodson in positions of power. We've got the Linda Bernies. We've got incredible bodies of people who are willing to speak up and be a voice for our people. And we're wanting to be included into the conversation. And what we're, as Aboriginal people, we are deconstructing the systems, the power systems that exist. So yes, whether you're Liberal or Labor, whether you're Greens, whether you don't have a strong political position, Aboriginal people still should be at the forefront in terms of your decision-making processes. And I'm tired that we still get denied that basic human right. And what you're talking about is absolutely imperative and interconnected to the policies and procedures that we have had to live through, survive, resist, deconstruct and challenge for the last 230 years. So
Okay.
I don't know when.
I'm gonna have to put some of this.
I know,
please.
but
Some
I
of this
don't
to the
know
political
when.
representatives. Go ahead.
Not to you. It's about the systems. It's
Yeah.
about the power systems that exist. So I don't know how. I don't know how, which are failing us. They are failing us dismally. The fact that Malcolm Turnbull is a byproduct of Tony Abbott, who cut $500 million in his first budget. $500 million from programs and infrastructure and resources to Aboriginal Australia, just as indicative about what this government thinks about Aboriginal
Okay,
Australia.
Sharina, I'm going to have to put some of this to... Josh is here representing the government. The core part of that question, there were a number of things, but obviously one of the things was the rejection of the Uluru Memorandum, and particularly the idea of having a representative body to advise the Parliament outside of the Parliament. Why was that rejected out of hand?
Because Australians have equal rights to vote, equal rights to sit in the Parliament, and equal rights to serve. And
Aboriginal people did not have equal rights until my mother was born in 1965, and she was not considered a human being until the referendum came through to the Floor and Frontier
Yes.
Act in 1967.
And you know
so
who-
no,
and
the equal rights are not even.
And you know who led that charge? Was Harold Holt, who reached across the divide to Gough Whitlam. My point is this, right? Having equal rights to sit in the Parliament is inconsistent with the principle of a third chamber.
It's no third.
Now,
Oh, for
it
goodness sake.
is a third chamber. Now, the issues you raise about closing the gap are legitimate. We have to do better. There is no shortage of goodwill, and there's been huge amounts of money spent. But if you talked about infant mortality, we've got a long way to go, but we have fallen in infant mortality in Indigenous communities by 35% since 1990.
Okay, Josh, I'm just going to bring you down to one point, because you said it's a third chamber.
It is.
Everyone in the Indigenous community says it's not.
Well, it's
the people who designed it say it's not. Why do you say it is?
Because it's going to be entrenched in the Constitution, it will be elected representatives, and it will be advising the Parliament on issues that relate to Indigenous people. Now, that is everything. That is social welfare, that is defence, that is health, that is education.
But Josh, what's wrong with advice?
Yes.
Because we, as government, seek out advice in everything we do. That's why we have a professional public service.
Josh, you do not still seek out the advice of Aboriginal people. You still do not consult Aboriginal people.
And if you-
Constitutional reform is about empowering that voice. It's not about creating a third chamber in the cabinet. It's not about special privileges for Aboriginal people. It's about allocating and ascending Aboriginal Australia to where your own party is at.
Okay, let's hear from the other panellists. Louise.
All I wanted to say was that you say you seek out advice. Shireena's the Uluru Statement is actually providing you with the opportunity to get that advice. It seems so obvious to me.
Okay, Chris Bowen, because the Labor Party obviously has committed to doing this.
Yes. In rejecting the Uluru Statement, Malcolm Turnbull may well go down as the Prime Minister who broke the nation's heart. We had a unique opportunity, and I fear it's past. Everybody says they agree with Indigenous recognition in the Constitution, and yet we can't do it. Now, the Indigenous community quite rightly says we don't want it to be symbolic. We just don't want to be mentioned in the Constitution just in passing. We want real change. And I actually want to pay credit to some constitutional conservatives who you would expect to reject this. People like Professor Greg Craven, who's put a lot of thought into what might work and have written a book about it, The Forgotten People, about what might work. Now, it is not a third chamber of Parliament. I'm sorry, Josh, it is fundamentally dishonest to call it a third chamber of Parliament.
That's not true.
It would not have power of veto over any policy. It would not be deliberative over policy. It would be advisory. And I think, for one, as the alternative Treasurer, have no problem with getting that advice, and I have no problem with it being enshrined in the Constitution. And we've said we'd legislate it as a first step, because we won't get it into the Constitution unless and until it becomes bipartisan. But as a first step, if we're elected, at least we will legislate an advisory group. But look, we have spent time on marriage equality through a plebiscite, which the Parliament could have done. We spent time on all these issues. We could have spent this time on Indigenous recognition. We could have done it for the 50th anniversary of that most important referendum in the same spirit of the 1967 referendum. We could have done it on the 50th anniversary. We lost that opportunity because of a lack of political leadership. And Malcolm Turnbull, standing at the dispatch box last week and goading us and saying, if you go down this road, I'll make this an election issue, was nothing short of disgusting.
Well, Warren Mundine, your own president of the Labor Party...
It's been a long time since he's been in the Labor Party.
President of the Labor
He
said that this idea, the voice, was a solution looking for a problem.
Well, I don't think Australia's Indigenous people...
Can you stop? I'm really tired of non-Indigenous peoples making commentaries about Indigenous Australia, because we've spent yourself included, we have spent 230 years... 230 years of not being included in this constitution. We share sovereignty with the Crown. The Queen still owns some of our traditional lands. We're still begging to protect sacred sites that are over 80,000 years old from mining companies, from gas companies. We want to be the author of our own destinies. We want to be the voice, because we are tired of non-Indigenous Australia thinking they know what is good for us and thinking that they can be the voice for Aboriginal Australia. So they should all learn to keep their mouths shut and start engaging Aboriginal Australia into the conversation.
Okay.
All right. I think we should all take a breath after that one. Okay, so can I just hear some of you guys' voices on what some of your initial thoughts were in watching that? Anybody?
I feel like she was just saying that we all knew.
Yep, I agree with you. I agree. Because that's the thing, that like for those of us that do come from an Indigenous space, or we have actually opened our eyes to it, we all know that non-Indigenous people always want to speak on Indigenous issues. They always want to speak about what they think is best for us. And the fact of the matter is that so many times they get it completely wrong. And that conversation that we just saw then was basically about the Parliament wanting to create an advisory panel. No different to a working group that would happen in a corporate organisation. Just to get some consultancy happening there with Indigenous people as to when we want to put forward this policy, how can we do it in an Indigenous context? How can we make sure that when we do this for the Indigenous people, that we are doing it right? And you saw the pushback from Josh there. He's like, it's a third chamber. It's certainly not a third chamber. It's an advisory group. It's a working group. Like, what are you going on about, Josh? And the thing is, the thing that really stood out to me when I watched it was the fact that you had Josh and Chris going back and forth as white men that have no experience in an Indigenous context, saying that they both know what's best for their Indigenous people, when there was an Indigenous woman sitting right between the two of them, quite literally. And that was just taken completely out of the conversation until she said, guys, I've had enough. Let me have a tea. And it wasn't until that moment that both of those men realized, oh, hey, there's actually an Indigenous person at the table. And how many times in life has that happened? It happens a lot of the time. And that's the thing that I know personally as a half Maori woman, and I know most people in Indigenous contexts, whether it will be Native American, whether it will be Australian Indigenous, whether it's Inuit in Canada, all the same. When we're asking for our voice at the table, it generally does not happen. And that brings me to my next point as to why should the body of the Constitution be changed to include Australian Indigenous folks? Now, when the Constitution came into effect in 1901, bear in mind that Australia has only been a country not for very long. It pretty much just came of age. They've decided Australia is now an adult, Australia can now make some decisions. And they made some pretty shitty ones in that process. So the most glaring one there out of all the clauses and all the sections of the Constitution is Section 51. So what does Section 51 entail? Well, firstly, the biggest racist piece of crap in the history of the Australian Constitution, where it basically says that it's all well and good for the government to make laws in order of peace, order of good government for the Commonwealth, for people of every single race, except for the Aboriginal people of any state, for whom it is necessary to make special laws. It doesn't recognise that the Indigenous people of Australia are citizens. They are not making special laws to go in context of the LORE law of those peoples in those nations, in those states. And then followed by that, we have Section 127, where in reckoning the numbers of the people of the Commonwealth or of a state or any other part of the Commonwealth, Aboriginal natives shall not be counted. So just as the Aboriginal sister said in the video, it wasn't until 2 years after her mother was born that she was recognised to be a human being. I don't think I have to explain to you why that's problematic. With both those sections changed in 1967, after over 90% of eligible voters were voted in a referendum to change that constitution to remove the words other than the Aboriginal people in any state, which is the exact same amendment that she was referring to that made Aboriginal people classified as human and no more fauna. And the whole section of 127 was also removed. The referendum provided the highest votes ever recorded in a federal referendum and is still celebrated on the 27th of May every year as the start of National Reconciliation Week. It doesn't mean our job is done in terms of reconciliation for the Indigenous Australian people. Far from it. And we all know that. But what many Australians don't understand is that even though there has been those amendments to remove Section 51 and Section 127 of the Constitution, there are still racist, discriminative remarks through Sections 25 and still some in 51. So let's have a look at this a little bit further. Okay, just go get this to work for me. Oops, wrong way. So what changes to the body of the Constitution have been proposed? So we need to first and foremost, fix the historical exclusion of Indigenous Australians into the Constitution itself. We're not even including the preamble. Secondly, we need to remove those references that remain in the Constitution that allows discrimination on basis of race. If it was any other race that was mentioned there, it would have been called out years ago. We all know that. But because it's Australian Indigenous people, for some strange, unknown reason, it's not identified that this is a potential issue. We all know it is, but no one's doing anything actively to remove that discrimination. So the amendments that Reconciliation New South Wales have put forward to fix this constitution is remove Section 25, which states that the states can ban people from voting based on their race. Is it just important to note there that when women had the right to vote, that right to vote was not extended to the Indigenous people. They had to actually fight after the fight has already been won for women of European descent and heritage to be able to vote the same as men. So I just thought that would be important to note there. In 51, which passed laws that discriminate against people based on race, insert a new section, 51A, to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples and preserve the Australian government's ability to pass laws for the benefit of Australian and Torres Strait Islander people. I am yet to see a law that explicitly is for the benefit of Aboriginal people. I have not seen one. If someone has, please raise your hand, let me know. Because I generally see a lot of laws that are coming out to censor Indigenous people. Because that's the thing, that even Adam Goodes is in the final quarter, if any of you have seen it, he spoke about the same thing, that there's such thing as being the good Aboriginal. As long as you met their criteria, you were a good person, you were a good citizen, you were a passable Aboriginal person. And it really shouldn't be that way. Not in the slightest. And funnily enough, next one, 116A, banning racial discrimination by government. We all know that's not going to change. It's been over 230 years of racial discrimination in Australia. Nothing is getting done for the blatant discrimination against Indigenous people. Whether that will be an unconscious bias or whether it's done deliberately, leaves a lot to be determined. Yet nothing is getting done in that space. And the final amendment is recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages, of which there is over traditionally 200 languages within Australia, as the country's first tongues. However, confirming that English is Australia's national language. Now, I understand that recognising 200 individual languages may be a little problematic. But at the same time, why are we having the forced erasure of 200 individual languages across the country of Australia just to sit the colonisers up on a level saying, we only speak English here? I don't think I really need to go into a great deal of context to explain the implications of that. Part of it comes from the Stolen Generations and the White Australia policy that basically forbidden these Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders from speaking their home languages to the point that they became erased. I don't think I have to explain to you why that's problematic. So what would a constitutional change do? Like, what would this piece of paper do to change the lives of Indigenous peoples? Just like the 1967 referendum, the Bridge Walks in 2000, and the 2008 National Apology of the Australian Indigenous peoples, recognising that Australian Indigenous people in the Australian Constitution will be just yet another step towards the reconciliation journey. The recognition of Australian and Indigenous people in the Constitution has the potential to address the history of exclusion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in the life of the nation. We all know that the history being taught to students in primary schools and high schools and other educational institutions is very whitewashed. Very whitewashed to the point that if an Indigenous person was to stand up on a pedestal and say, that's not how it happened, my ancestor was there, people will call bullshit. And I don't think that's fair. I really do not. So I think first and foremost that we need to identify that there's always three sides to every story. His side, her side, and the truth. So we also need to improve the sense of self-worth and social and emotional well-being of Australian Indigenous peoples both as individuals, communities, and as part of the national identity. I think the most important part of that statement is the last three sections, the individuals. So we had people going, I know who I am in my authentic self. The communities basically saying that I am such and such from this particular nation, and be able to sit in that comfortably without having to hide any part of their authentic selves, and as part of the national identity. The national identity of Australia, if you were abroad and asked somebody, what do you think it means to be Australian? They will give you a very European worldview. They will tell you that it involves barbecues. They will tell you that it involves koalas and snakes. Every year when I go to Scotland and I tell them that I am from Australia, first thing they ask me is if I've been attacked by wildlife. They don't ask me anything about our Indigenous people. Not if I know how to play a didgeridoo, nothing like that. So I think it's very important for us to build the Indigenous identity into our national identity. Okay, I'm going to take a breath for a second. And then we have enshrine the principles of non-discrimination into our constitution. I don't think that even needs to be said. I really don't. For the simple fact that if, like I said previously, if it was any other race, it wouldn't be an issue. It would have been called out for what it is. So we've got to really sit there and listen to what we are saying, and more importantly, what we are not saying, and find that balance between the two. We need to change the context in which debates about challenges faced by Australian Indigenous communities take place, and build positive relationships based on trust and mutual respect between Indigenous Australians and the broader Australian community. Personally, I laugh my ass off when I hear that, because how are we supposed to build a positive relationship built on trust and mutual respect when the colonizers, the European peoples that came to Australia, invaded the lands, have done nothing but basically disrespect the people that are there, erase their language, erase their culture, erase their law, yet want them to be the token Indigenous person, the good Indigenous person, whilst not acknowledging any of their history. Whilst you're not acknowledging any of that history or any of the diversity that is getting built into those spaces, how are you going to build a relationship of trust and mutual respect? We could not, like Indigenous peoples, I wouldn't even say nationwide, I'll say globally, cannot trust a European government not to hurt them, their children, or to have not even hurt their ancestors. That's through things such as stolen generations, the assimilation practices. When it comes to New Zealand, we're talking about the dawn raids, which have been in the news very recently with Jacinda Ardern apologising. Nothing has changed, no matter which nation you come from. And they're asking for trust and mutual respect. I don't think that is ever going to be something that basically happens. Because like our Indigenous sister said in the video, when you say sorry, you do not do it again. And that's the only thing that we're seeing, that this constant repetition that breaks that trust and that mutual respect constantly. Constantly. So for them to be able to effectively do any of that, we need to basically support the social, economic, and civil inclusion through boards such as the advisory board that was proposed back in 2018. Putting the Indigenous Australians within the broader Australian community. Reforming a constitution is a critical step towards overcoming the Indigenous disadvantage, closing the gap, meeting 7 of the 7 targets, and bringing non-Indigenous, Torres Strait and Aboriginal people and communities closer together. So how have other countries included their Indigenous people in their constitution? Well, this is just 3 examples. So in Canada, they have just this very simple statement at the very front of their constitution that says that the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognised and affirmed. Seems really simple, doesn't it? Something really simple, just to acknowledge them right in that moment. The United States has negotiated nearly 390 treaties with American Indian tribes, which the Supreme Court recognizes as similar to treaties between different nations. The Constitution gives the federal government the sole power to deal with tribes. The Treaty of Waitangi encapsulates many of the rights of the Maori in New Zealand. It's used as the foundation for human rights for Maori, and many of its principles are incorporated into New Zealand's Constitution Act. Now, when I say that these are the ways that other countries have included their Indigenous people within the Constitution, it's very important to also note that the Australian Indigenous people do not have a treaty. They do not have their recognition in the Constitution. And people wonder why they're a little bit angry. This is why. Because they're being completely erased from the history of Australia. They've been erased from being able to contribute to what will be in a society where they are expected to live, work, and otherwise do business. So would recognising Indigenous Australians in the Constitution give them any special rights that other Australians don't have? Well, acknowledging them in the preamble, which is that one simple statement like the Canadian government has, does not give them any additional rights to other Australians. And changing the body of the Constitution does not give them greater quality of protection from discrimination, but it does give them better rights protections. Currently, they have 0 protection, just to put it into context. So why can't we just change the Constitution? Like we all decided these things need to be changed. Why aren't we just doing it? Because the only way to change the Constitution is through a referendum. The constitutional referendum, when all voting age Australians vote either yes or no to a proposed change. So we need a majority of people to say, yes, this is what needs to happen. But when you have people that are basically sitting there going, why hasn't this already happened? Why are we even having this conversation? And they're going, well, just do it. And not only that, but it's also important to bear in mind that most Australians don't vote by default. They don't sign up for the Electoral Commission at the age of 18. They try to dodge voting. So why would they willingly come to the table for a community that is not of themselves to say, yes, include these other people? When there is a myth that Australian Indigenous peoples are receiving more welfare, more programs, more free education than anybody else, and it is a goddamn myth, why would they say yes to more protections? So now that I've given you all that information and taken up an hour of your time, I'm going to ask, like, if it was up to you to create a more inclusive social construct or constitution for our Australian Indigenous people, what would that look like? Is there any feedback?
I'm just trying to think of something. That's a lot to think about.
It's a lot to think about. But that's the thing, that there's no wrong answers. You're basically asking, how are you going to include a community that by all rights could kick us out tomorrow if they wanted to? They got every right to do that. Because basically what has happened is that when invasion happened, this is the way that I explain it to my own kids. These people found a random house. They decided, rather than knock on the door, we'll just jump over the fence and have a party, it's fine. That's not the way that it should have been. So now, because we jumped the fence and decided to have a party in these people's backyards, how are we going to firstly apologize to them for jumping in their backyard? Secondly, how are we going to make sure it doesn't happen again? And thirdly, how do we recognize that there was people living in that house to start with? That make it a little bit easier to break down?
For some reason, I think about we've got to play on their rules to get what we want, if that makes sense.
Unpack that a little bit more for me.
Oh, I've got mind blank now. No, I can't answer the question. Like if we had a spokesperson for this that we all, I don't know, we all like, and I don't know, I'm not explaining this properly.
Yeah, I see your question in the chat too. Like, is it the same thing as the gay marriage referendum? No, it's not, because the difference is that the gay marriage thing was actually a plebiscite. It wasn't a referendum. So the thing is that when it comes to plebiscites, is that you can basically vote yes or no. And then if it comes to the point where it's like too close to call, or if there's a tie, the government would then make a decision. The problem when it comes to referendums is that you need a vast majority of yes or vast majority of no to basically structure which way you're going to go. And if there's a large majority of no, you have a very large period of time that needs to pass before it comes up as a referendum subject again. So that's the problem that we're dealing with as Indigenous folk, trying to get this inclusion into a written document that should be for all Australians. It basically comes down to the exact same notion happening within the United States with the Declaration of Independence, and how it doesn't include the African slaves that they decided to take on shore. Yet their ancestors are living there now. Everything that they have been taught, again, comes under assimilation, the same as the Australian Indigenous people that were stolen from their families and put up in white civilization. So if we're going to build a constitution that involves those voices as well, like you said, that we need to basically find a representative that everyone knows and likes. The biggest problem with that, no one likes politicians. So I think the biggest one that we're going to be having to look for is, where can we marry up the happy mediums? You get what I'm saying with that? So.
I don't know much about Aboriginal history except for what I've learned in uni. I am not Australian in any way. I've only lived here for 3 years. But my understanding of the history and attempted reconciliation and everything else that's happened in between, including the stolen generation, which I still don't understand how that happened to this day, and how that is something that has never been addressed fully or really discussed in an open forum. I think essentially the foundational element that needs to be sort of established is trust, because there is no trust between essentially the two sides of this engagement. There's nothing that exists to build this upon.
Exactly.
After everything that's happened, there's never been, I guess, from what I read and from what I watch, genuine reach out or concern or efforts to fully reconcile and actually provide a platform for discussions.
Exactly.
So I never really know what to say in this kind of discussion because I don't have the background for it. I know what I can say for my own background. I could potentially be more vocal about the Black Lives Matter movement because there's an element of connection to my own upbringing and my own background. But because I don't know what's been done, or I can't find information about what's been done or what's happened in this space, I know how I feel about it, but that's not necessarily what can be done about it. It's not the practical steps that need to be taken. So for me, it's about building that trust for people to then be able to have that conversation, because at this point in time, if you're approaching an Aboriginal person whose ancestry maybe involves both the stolen generation, the colonization, and you're like, we want to work things out. This is what we propose we do. Why should they believe you? Because in both instances, you came with promises, but you took so much.
Yep. I totally agree with you, because that's the biggest problem that a lot of Indigenous people have now, that because of the stolen generations and the assimilation practices, that a lot of them can't even identify which nation they're from.
Yeah, and that's a
and that's a really big issue, because even though they've decided, if you can get recognized by that community as an Indigenous person, then you identify as Indigenous.
Yeah.
Which is a very colonial worldview, for the simple fact that because of the stolen generations and people losing their names and being given a European one, what makes it very difficult is in terms of being able to track any of that genealogy, you have to take a very European route. Where I know personally, especially in Maori, when you have to recite what we call a prepare, it's basically like, it'll be like, I know my daughter's one off the top of my head. So like hers will be, my name is Phoenix, my mountain is Taranaki, my river is Hutt, my family is from Lower Hutt, we are Te Awa. It's basically, we need to identify which mountain are we next to. Our village is located next to this particular river. Our suburb is now this. Our tribe's people are named that. Where I don't know if the same thing exists in Indigenous Australian. I don't want to assume that it does. But the thing is that if you are one of those persons that went through assimilation, you wouldn't know any of those things. You would just know that you grew up in Whoop Whoop out somewhere. You would know that you were raised by John and Mary. You wouldn't know what your connections to country are. So the Australian government, asking them to be recognised by their land council, you understand how it's problematic, because there is nothing there in black and white. Well, there probably is in black and white, but it will have the European definitions rather than saying that this is this particular person. And names are very important. It's not just a matter of changing someone's name from Mary to Kim. It's basically, because the way that we look at it is that your name is only lent to you from your ancestors. So when our ancestors come forth, they recognize you, they know who you are, they know everything that you stand for. Where if you look at that from a very European point of view, there's just like, oh, I was pregnant and I needed a name for the child. It doesn't always flip back to, oh, I'm naming this my daughter Bernadette because that was her grandmother's name. It doesn't really flip back to that. And even then, it doesn't really have the cultural connection that it does for the Indigenous people.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's, well, I totally agree with you that when it comes down to respect, that will be the biggest one. Because the thing is that it's well and good to have conversations about what will work great for you. That's fine. But the fact of the matter is, if there's no respect within that space, you might as well just talk to a cloud, because you're going to get the same response.
Yeah, you need to lay a foundation.
You really do.
You can't just go straight to like, we need to do this, this, and this. It doesn't work.
It doesn't work. It doesn't work at all.
It doesn't. It's not going to change anything, because I imagine all of the policies and programs that have been developed or opportunities that have been created that are specific to Aboriginal people, yeah, they're there. But I've also seen a lot of articles talking about how they don't take up these opportunities. Has anyone asked why?
No one really looks why.
Anyone asked why they don't want to be in those spaces, participating in those programs? Because for me, I mostly learned Aboriginal health and stuff from my course, which is public health focus, on why Aboriginals have a lower life expectancy or morbidity or all of those other things. That's what I know better. And that's from statistics as well. Yeah. It's not a whole population study. Yeah.
So for you personally, what do you think it will be the reason why they don't engage?
It's a division that has existed for such a long time with no one. As much as there's so much talks of like bridging the gaps, let's bridge the gap, let's do this, let's reconcile. You can never walk in their shoes. As somebody, there's two sides of it. The side that was colonized and the side that colonized. And
exactly, yeah.
There will never be a full understanding of what it feels like to have everything taken from you. And I think there's an expectation that apologizing makes everything better. Apologizing is an acknowledgement of wrong, but it doesn't mean that these people forgot. And with the stolen generation, as you mentioned, they struggle with identity. Because on one end, they know they're of Aboriginal descent, but they need to get acknowledged. And to get acknowledged, right, the other side needs to look at them and fully, I don't know how that process works, but I know that there might be some sort of something stopping them from being acknowledged on the other end as well. So they're stuck in the middle. That creates bitter people, or it just, you can't expect a sorry and then we move on to doing things. There's a long process in between there that needs to be done. Unfortunately, I don't have the answers. I don't know what the solution is, but a conversation needs to start somewhere. And I think, like you mentioned as well, the first step is actually sitting down and saying, you know what, we are talking to somebody who is a human being, who has an opinion about what's best for them. No one else can decide what's best for them apart from them. And that is the biggest thing, is there's a lot of people who want to sit around a big table and make decisions without consulting anyone, because that would be difficult, because that would create a discussion that might take too long for them, essentially, because there's only a certain term, right, that you're in office. And I can't imagine in a political point of view that they want to elongate that process, because it's not going to take months. It could take years.
It could take years.
And by the time you've actually
not chipping at it.
Yeah.
And that's
by
the thing.
Implemented something, your term could be over. And I think a lot of people in a position of power could have an issue with something that takes up so much of their time, and they actually don't get to be part of the rewards. if you get what I mean. So there's just so many elements to it that I don't know what can be done, but I really would like to see what happens in that space. And I can have an opinion, but like I mentioned before, I'm not Aboriginal.
Yeah.
I can never understand what they went through, ever.
Yeah.
And I can't have a voice.
That's the thing, like,
I can have an opinion, but it's not enough for me to stand up and be like, this is what should be done. I can support what they think should be done.
Exactly.
I can't have that opinion that is definitive about like, this is the right thing to do. How would I know?
Yeah, because that's the thing, that like if an Indigenous person came to you and said, Tarai, I need your solidarity in this particular thing, and these are the reasons why, and you have that fully informed opinion as to why this is made, then you can form an opinion on it.
Yeah.
But you can't speak on someone else's behalf. And I think that's one of the reasons why so many of these programs fail. Primarily because there's no Indigenous consultation. Secondly, no one's looking at the intergenerational trauma, where historically these programs were built for assimilation.
Yeah.
They weren't built to like further Indigenous excellence. They just weren't. There was basically just there to like, we're going to teach you how to be civilized white folk and how to actually be able to present yourself in societal surroundings. And I think that's where the problem lies with these programs now, that even in saying that these are built for Indigenous people, how many people within that organization are actually Indigenous? Or do they only have a token Indigenous officer or liaison that makes the Indigenous people go, oh, they're saying that they're inclusive, but they only have one person.
Yeah.
Where if it's like the land council and they do these programs, a lot more people engage. But if it's basically a white-facing organization and they're going, oh, we're going to do something, and like I was just part of an organization that the only thing that they do for Indigenous people all year, Reconciliation Week, NAIDOC, that's it. And I was part of the inclusion department. So you can see why that's an issue.
Yeah, no, it's just, I come across so many job listings, for example, where there are specific positions that have been created for an Aboriginal person. And I'm reading through the job specifications or the qualifications or just the whole, the way they've sort of described the role and then gone into the person we're looking for kind of scenario. And sometimes I feel like some of them really do come across as condescending, almost as like we are looking for the bare minimum. Well, it almost comes across as if you expect that person who applies for this role to not have the qualities, I guess, that go above the bare minimum. I don't know if I'm expressing myself right.
Well, that's like, the thing, that there's a thing called Aboriginal English where you only say the bits that are most important. I can completely get that. And I've done the same thing. I've looked at, because I was like looking for a job again recently. And I just took one that was an identified position for an Indigenous person, and then the exact same role in the exact same company right next to it. And what you're saying is completely correct, that the way that they word it for the identified position makes the person seem like a numpty.
That's it. I didn't want to say
it. It seemed like an absolute numpty. And I'm like, why do you not just, like, if you're looking for the exact same skill set, why are we not using the same language? Like, there might be some cultural nuances that you would need to use there because it is an identified position. But at the same time, don't discredit people in their understanding based on their cultural identity. Nothing annoys me more. But I do appreciate you coming along today, Vicky-Rae, and thank you for being part of the conversations.
I'm glad to have listened to this and watched everything. I've never seen any of this. I learned so much from today's presentation. Thank you so much for
You're very welcome.
the time to create it as well. It's going to be part of our meeting this afternoon. I don't know if you're going to be able to make it to that one.
Yeah, I will be.
Yeah, it's part of the updates. I think it would be